In the radiant heart of Renaissance Florence, a city where genius, beauty, and wealth seemed to flow like water, one man rose to turn that brilliance into darkness. His name was Girolamo Savonarola, and for 4 years he bent the most dazzling city of Italy to his will through fire, fear, and fanaticism. The people who once hailed him as God's prophet would, in the end, drag him to his death, for power built on terror can never last, and when it collapses violently. May 23, 1498, the morning sun casts long shadows across the Piazza della Signoria. Thousands of Florentines crowd the square, not to hear a sermon, but to see the downfall of the man who had ruled their souls. Today, the prophet would burn. Today, the preacher who promised salvation through fire would himself be given to the flames. This is not just the account of one man's execution. It is the cautionary tale of how power corrodes faith, how fear can enslave a people, and how the mask of righteousness often hides the face of tyranny. Florence in the late 15th century stood at the crossroads of history. The Renaissance, nurtured by the mighty Medici, had made it the jewel of Europe. Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent turned the city into a beacon of art and intellect. Michelangelo carved stone into breathing bodies. Botticelli painted Venus rising from her seashell. Scholars revived the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome. Florence glittered like no other city in Christendom, but beneath the surface of this golden brilliance, shadows stirred. The Catholic Church reeled from scandal. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, flaunted his mistresses and auctioned holy offices to the highest bidder. Many ordinary believers felt betrayed, and though they lived among palaces and cathedrals, Florence's poor still struggled with hunger, disease, and despair. They longed for a voice that would cut through corruption and hypocrisy, a voice that promised purity and truth. That voice came in the unlikely figure of a Dominican friar from Ferrara, Girolamo Savonarola. Born in 1452, his early years were marked by heartbreak and rejection. Spurned in love, he abandoned worldly ambitions and embraced the cloister. Yet, when he first tried preaching, he was stiff, awkward, and unpersuasive. Crowds drifted away from his sermons, unimpressed by his rasping voice. But failure only hardened him, forging an unbending zeal that left no room for compromise. In 1490, Savonarola returned to Florence. Something in him had changed. The awkward friar now thundered with apocalyptic visions. He preached of God's wrath, of cities drowning in blood, of divine judgment for a world drunk on vanity. His sermons no longer stumbled, they roared. When the French king, Charles VIII, invaded Italy in 1494, just as Savonarola had foretold, the city saw prophecy come to life. The Medici fled, the political order crumbled, and the people, terrified, turned to the man who claimed to have seen it all in visions. If he had been right about the French, perhaps he spoke for heaven itself. Savonarola filled the vacuum with terrifying speed. Declaring Florence the New Jerusalem, he proclaimed Christ as its king and himself as the prophet who would enforce God's will. But his Florence was no longer a city of Renaissance brilliance. It became a theocracy ruled by spies, informants, and roving bands of children trained to root out sin. These child enforcers stormed homes, confiscating jewelry, paintings, books, even musical instruments, anything deemed vain. What followed became infamous, the bonfire of the vanities. Citizens piled treasures into the Piazza della Signoria: cosmetics, silks, secular literature, even priceless works of art. Flames devoured Florence's brilliance, rising higher than the city's rooftops. Botticelli himself, once a painter of myth and beauty, is said to have consigned some of his canvases to the blaze. But Savonarola's fire consumed more than objects. He called for executions, tortures, and purges. Prostitutes were driven from the city. Scholars were silenced or exiled. Laughter, music, and art were viewed as scenes. Florence, the cradle of humanist glory, was turned into a city of hushed voices and lowered eyes. Yet no tyranny lasts forever. Savonarola's fiery sermons soon turned their wrath toward Rome itself. He condemned Pope Alexander VI as corrupt, even as illegitimate. The Pope responded with excommunication in 1497, cutting Florence off from the sacraments. For many Florentines, it was the first crack in their prophet's mask. Savonarola raged, calling the Pope the Antichrist. But now, doubt had entered the city. How could God's chosen messenger defy the church itself, desperate to prove divine favor? Savonarola agreed in 1498 to a trial by fire. If he could walk through flames unharmed, it would prove his mission. Crowds filled the piazza once again, but when the moment came, he faltered. Rain dampened the wood, excuses were made, and the ordeal collapsed in farce. The prophet who demanded unwavering faith had failed his own test. Florence's awe turned to laughter, then to rage. Days later, mobs stormed the convent of San Marco. Savonarola was dragged from his cell, his body aged, his face hollow, stripped of the fire that once ruled the city. Torture followed tyrannically, the very strappado he had endorsed as a holy tool against heretics. Under agony, he confessed to crimes, though later he recanted. But the outcome was already written. On May 23, 1498, Girolamo Savonarola was led into the Piazza della Signoria, where he had once ordered bonfires of art and culture. His own pyre now stood waiting. Stripped of his robes, condemned by both church and city, the prophet was hanged and then burned, his ashes scattered into the Arno so that no relic of him might remain. The man who had promised heaven delivered only fear, and Florence, scarred yet unbroken, slowly returned to the light of the Renaissance. Savonarola's story endures as a stark warning that the most dangerous tyrants are not crowned with gold, but cloaked in virtue preachers who speak of salvation, yet leave only ashes in their wake. The strongest will. The prisoner's hands were bound behind his back and attached to a rope that passed over a pulley. He was then hoisted into the air by his arms with his full body weight, pulling against shoulders that were never designed to bear such stress. The initial lifting was agonizing enough, as the victim felt his shoulder joints begin to separate under the unnatural strain. But the true horror came when the torturer would suddenly release the rope, allowing the prisoner to fall several feet before jerking to a violent stop. The sound of bones popping and ligaments tearing was clearly audible to everyone in the chamber. Each drop caused excruciating pain as the victim's shoulders were gradually dislocated, while the sudden stop sent shock waves of agony through every nerve in the body. Contemporary accounts describe Savonarola's screams echoing through the palace as the torture sessions continued hour after hour, day after day. The man who had preached about the purifying nature of suffering was learning firsthand what his victims had endured. His torturers, many of whom had lost friends or family members to his reign of terror, showed no mercy as they applied the techniques that the friar had once endorsed. Between sessions on the rack, he was returned to a cell barely large enough for a man to lie down, where infection and fever from his injuries added to his torment. The psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than the physical pain. Savonarola had built his entire identity around his claim to divine revelation, his absolute certainty that God spoke through him. But as the torture continued, and no divine intervention came to save him, that certainty began to crumble. Where was the God who had supposedly chosen him as prophet? Why were his prayers for deliverance going unanswered? The silence of heaven was more crushing than any physical blow his torturers could deliver. After 2 weeks of systematic torture, Savonarola's body and spirit were broken. His arms hung useless at his sides, dislocated and twisted into unnatural positions. His voice, once powerful enough to command a city, was reduced to a hoarse whisper. Most devastating of all, his faith, the foundation upon which he had built his entire life, lay in ruins. The confession he finally signed admitted that his visions had been lies, that his prophecies were the product of his own ambition rather than divine revelation, and that he had led Florence astray for his own glory. But even this humiliating confession was not enough to satisfy the appetite for revenge that had built up during Savonarola's reign. Lawrence had suffered too much under his tyranny to be satisfied with mere imprisonment or exile. The city demanded blood, and they would have it in the most public and humiliating way possible. Savonarola would die where he had held his bonfires, in the same square where he had presided over the destruction of so much beauty and culture. The flames that had consumed art and literature would now consume the man who had lit them. The execution was scheduled for May 23, 1498, giving the city time to prepare a spectacle worthy of the occasion. Carpenters erected a massive platform in the center of the Piazza della Signoria, tall enough to be visible from every corner of the square. A gibbet was constructed for the hanging, while beneath it, workers piled wood and kindling for a fire that would burn hot enough to consume not just flesh and bone, but any trace that Girolamo Savonarola had ever existed. This would not be a quick death, but a prolonged agony that would serve as entertainment for the masses and warning to future wood tyrants. As word of the execution spread throughout Tuscany, people began arriving in Florence from hundreds of miles away. They came not out of sympathy for the condemned man, but out of curiosity to see the fall of someone who had wielded such terrible power. Merchants closed their shops, farmers abandoned their fields, and nobles left their palaces to witness this final act in the drama that had held all of Italy spellbound. By dawn, on the day of execution, the Piazza d'Oria was packed with humanity, a sea of faces united in their desire to see justice done. The crowd's mood was festive rather than solemn, more like a carnival than a religious ceremony. Vendors sold food and wine to the spectators, while pickpockets worked the dense crowd and prostitutes. The same women Savonarola had driven from the city openly plied their trade in defiance of his memory. Children who had once served as his enforcers now threw stones and shouted insults at the platform where he would die. The city that had trembled in fear for 4 years was finally celebrating its freedom, and that celebration would be baptized in the blood of the man who had stolen their joy. When the prison doors opened at dawn, the figure that emerged bore no resemblance to the commanding prophet who had once ruled Florence. Savonarola had to be carried rather than walked, his tortured body unable to support its own weight. His arms hung at impossible angles, clearly broken and badly set. His face, once animated with divine fury, was gray and drawn with pain and despair. Most shocking of all was his silence. The man whose voice had once thundered across the city now seemed incapable of speech, whether from physical damage to his throat or psychological collapse. The procession to the scaffold was deliberately slow, giving the crowd maximum opportunity to vent their fury on the man who had terrorized them for so long. Guards had to form a protective cordon around the prisoner as citizens pressed forward to spit on him, strike him with sticks, and hurl the vilest insults they could conceive. Some threw rotting fruit and animal waste, while others simply screamed their hatred until their voices gave out. This was not the dignified march of a martyr to his death, but the degrading parade of a tyrant facing the justice he had denied to others. As they reached the scaffold, Savonarola was stripped of the simple brown robe he wore, leaving him naked before the crowd that had once warped him. This final humiliation was calculated to destroy any remaining dignity he might have possessed, to show the thousands of spectators that their former prophet was nothing more than weak flesh and broken bone. The man who had preached about the evil of physical beauty and the need for modesty now stood exposed in his own human frailty, a living demonstration of the mortality he had denied when claiming divine authority. The execution itself was designed to combine multiple forms of death in the most agonizing way possible. First, Savonarola would be hanged by the neck, but not long enough to die, just until he lost consciousness and his body went limp. Then, he would be revived and hanged again, repeating the process until his torturers judged that he had suffered sufficiently. Only then would the fire be lit beneath him, ensuring that he would be conscious to experience the full horror of being burned alive. This was not simply execution, but elaborate torture designed to satisfy the crowd's thirst for revenge. As the rope was placed around Savonarola's neck, he attempted to speak, perhaps to pray, perhaps to proclaim his innocence one final time, but his voice was too weak to carry over the roar of the crowd, and his words were lost in the cacophony of jeers and cheers that erupted as the executioner prepared to do his work. The man who had commanded silence with a gesture now could not make himself heard above the noise of those he had once terrorized. Even his final moments were denied the dignity he had stripped from his own victims. The first hanging was brief, just long enough to demonstrate the executioner's control over life and death. Savonarola's body jerked and twisted at the end of the rope as his face turned purple and his eyes bulged from their sockets. The crowd cheered as he lost consciousness, but their celebration was premature. This was only the beginning of his ordeal. When he was lowered and revived, the process began again, each repetition extracting new screams of agony from the condemned man and fresh roars of approval from the spectators. After the third hanging, with Savonarola barely conscious and his body racked with convulsions, the torches were finally applied to the kindling piled beneath the scaffold. The flames caught quickly, fed by the dry wood and pitch that had been carefully prepared for maximum heat. As the fire spread upward toward the platform, the crowd pressed closer, eager to see every detail of their former tyrant's final moments. This was the culmination of months of planning. The moment when Florence would finally be free of the man who had held it in chains of fear and fanaticism. The smell of burning wood soon gave way to something far more horrific as the flames reached Savonarola's feet and began to consume his living flesh. His screams, weak as they were, could still be heard above the crackling of the fire and the cheers of the crowd. Those closest to the scaffold later reported that he seemed to be trying to pray, even as the flames engulfed him, his lips moving in what might have been the words of the same psalms he had once used to terrorize others. But if God was listening to those final prayers, he chose not to intervene. The fire burned for hours, consuming not just Savonarola's body, but the wooden platform and gibbet as well. The crowd remained throughout, unwilling to leave, until they were certain that nothing remained of the man who had tormented them. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders to get a better view, while women who had been forced to burn their cosmetics and jewelry in his bonfires now watched with satisfaction as he experienced the same flames. Justice, they believed, had finally been served. When the fire finally died down to glowing coals, the authorities took one final step to ensure that Savonarola could never return to haunt Florence. His ashes and any remaining bone fragments were carefully collected and thrown into the Arno River, the same waterway that had carried away the ashes from his bonfires of the vanities. This was not just disposal of remains, but a deliberate act of eraser designed to prevent any of his followers from collecting relics that might be used to claim he was a martyr. Even in death, the authorities feared his power to inspire fanaticism. The crowd finally began to disperse as the sun set over Florence. But the celebration continued in taverns and homes throughout the city. For the first time in years, citizens felt free to laugh, to sing, to display beauty without fear of denunciation. The psychological chains that had bound them for so long had been broken, along with their tormentor's body. Artists emerged from hiding to begin creating again. Scholars dared to read forbidden books, and ordinary people allowed themselves to enjoy the simple pleasures that make life worth living. But the story of Girolamo Savonarola's rise and fall carries lessons that extend far beyond the borders of Renaissance Florence. His transformation from failed preacher to absolute ruler demonstrates how charismatic leaders can exploit fear and uncertainty to gain power over even sophisticated populations. The Florentines were not ignorant peasants, but educated citizens of Europe's most cultured city. Yet they surrendered their freedom to a man who promised them security and salvation in exchange for their obedience. The speed with which Savonarola's theocracy took hold should serve as a warning to any society that values freedom and tolerance. Within months of gaining influence, he had transformed Florence from a center of artistic achievement into a police state where children informed on their parents and neighbors lived in constant fear of denunciation. The institutions that had protected Florentine liberty, the guilds, the republican government, the checks and balances that prevented any individual from gaining too much power, all proved inadequate when faced with a leader who claimed divine authority. Perhaps most chilling of all is how quickly the population adapted to their new reality under Savonarola's rule. People who had lived their entire lives in relative freedom learned to accept surveillance, censorship, and the constant threat of violence as normal parts of daily existence. They convinced themselves that their suffering served a higher purpose, that the destruction of their culture was necessary for their spiritual salvation. This willing collaboration with tyranny demonstrates how even good people can be corrupted when they surrender their individual judgment to charismatic authority. The psychological techniques Savonarola used to maintain control, the creation of an atmosphere of constant crisis, the demonization of external enemies, the demand for absolute loyalty to his person rather than to principles or institutions have been employed by dictators throughout history. From the Spanish Inquisition to modern totalitarian regimes, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Leaders who claim special insight into divine will or historical destiny use that claim to justify the most extreme measures against their perceived enemies. The role of children in Savonarola's regime provides another disturbing parallel to later totalitarian movements. By organizing young people into bands of enforcers and encouraging them to inform on their own families, he broke down the basic bonds of trust that hold societies together. When children cannot trust their parents, and parents live in fear of their children, the family unit, traditionally the strongest bulwark against state power, becomes an instrument of oppression rather than protection. The destruction of art and culture during the bonfires of the vanities represents more than mere fanaticism. It was a calculated attack on the human spirit itself. Tyrants throughout history have understood that beauty, creativity, and independent thought pose fundamental threats to their power by destroying the cultural achievements that give people pride in their civilization. Authoritarian leaders isolate individuals from their past and make them more dependent on the promises of the future that only the leader can deliver. Yet, Savonarola's ultimate fate also demonstrates the inherent weakness of power built on fear and deception. His claims to divine authority could only be sustained as long as his followers believed in his special connection to God. When that belief was shaken first by the Pope's excommunication, then by his failure in the trial by fire, his entire system of control collapsed with shocking speed. The same crowds that had worshipped him turned against him with the fury of people who realized they had been deceived. The brutality of Savonarola's execution, while shocking to modern sensibilities, reflected the medieval understanding of justice as public spectacle designed to restore social order. The Florentines believed that his crimes against their city could only be balanced by his public suffering and humiliation. From their perspective, the man who had terrorized them for years deserved to experience the same fear and pain he had inflicted on others. The elaborate nature of his torture and execution was intended to serve as both punishment and deterrent. Modern readers might question whether such extreme vengeance was justified regardless of Savonarola's crimes. The torture that broke his body and spirit, the deliberate prolonging of his agony during the execution, and the careful orchestration of his public humiliation all raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the proper limits of punishment. Yet, it is important to remember that the Florentines viewed themselves as victims of a tyrant who had stolen years from their lives and destroyed irreplaceable cultural treasures. The immediate aftermath of Savonarola's death saw Florence return to its former glory with remarkable speed. Artists who had hidden their brushes during the years of theocracy emerged to create some of the Renaissance's greatest masterpieces. Scholars resumed their study of classical texts, merchants reopened their shops, and the city's famous festivals and celebrations returned to fill the streets with music and laughter. It was as if the city had awakened from a 4-year nightmare to discover that the world of beauty and learning they had lost could be rebuilt. Yet, the scars of Savonarola's reign never fully healed. Families that had been torn apart by denunciations struggled to rebuild trust. Artists who had burned their own works in moments of religious fervor mourned their lost creations. The generation of children who had served as the friars' enforcers carried psychological wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Florence had learned that civilization, no matter how advanced, remained fragile in the face of organized fanaticism. The broader implications of Savonarola's rise and fall continued to influence European history for centuries. His challenge to papal authority helped lay the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation that would split Christianity apart just 20 years later. His use of popular religious fervor to seize political power provided a template that would be followed by later revolutionaries and demagogues. His destruction of art and learning demonstrated how quickly cultural achievements could be erased by those who viewed them as threats to their ideology. Perhaps most importantly, Savonarola's story serves as a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. The Florentines who lived through his reign learned that liberty, once lost, is far more difficult to recover than it is to preserve. They discovered that the very qualities that make a society great, its tolerance, its openness to new ideas, its willingness to trust in the goodness of human nature, can also make it vulnerable to those who would exploit those qualities for their own ends. The ashes of Girolamo Savonarola may have been scattered in the Arno River 5 centuries ago, but the lessons of his life and death remain relevant to every generation that values freedom over security, tolerance over dogma, and beauty over ideology. His story stands as both warning and inspiration. A warning of how quickly civilization can descend into barbarism when good people allow fear to overcome reason, and an inspiration to all who believe that tyranny, no matter how powerful it may seem, ultimately cannot withstand the human desire for truth, beauty, and freedom. In the end, Savonarola's legacy is not the theocracy he created or the terror he inspired, but the Renaissance that flourished after his death. The art he tried to destroy was replaced by even greater masterpieces. The learning he attempted to suppress became the foundation for centuries of human progress. The spirit he sought to crush rose from the ashes of his execution to create a world more beautiful and more free than anything he could have imagined. That perhaps is the most fitting punishment for a man who believed that human nature was too corrupt to deserve joy, beauty, or the freedom to choose its own destiny.